I've known about you for ages, and I knew about you as the bestseller author from day one that I knew you. What are the topics like we don't agree on?
This video is going to be titled "Why Scott H. Young is a Fraud," and then it's going to be like,
I've got your approval on that.
Scott Young is an international best-selling author. You might have heard of some of his books, like Ultra Learning, which has been bought millions of times. I've got a copy of it myself. And this is a guy that knows his learning science. Apparently, people have been asking Scott about his opinion of me and my work. And one of my students shared an email interaction that he had with Scott where he sends him my report on learning, and then Scott was kind of critiquing parts of the research on it and being like, yeah, I don't know. So I was like, Scott, I think you and I need to have a chat. And Scott replied, bring it on, let's do it. And this video is how that conversation went down. Now, by the way, this is essentially like two nerds nerding out, so it does get a little bit technical, and if you're not into that, then this video is not gonna be for you. But a lot of you guys seem to really like the in-depth technical discussions, so hope you like this one too.
I've been meaning to talk to you for a while because I tend to be like, most of my reading is like trying to like have 400 books that are like kind of academic, that it's like, okay, I need to read this. So I'm always sort of like reading that, as opposed to necessarily always keeping up with like what other people like myself are doing, like who are kind of popularizing it or disseminating it. And so I was getting all these emails like, what do you think about Justin Sung saying this or saying that? And I always just say, well, I don't know that much about Justin Sung, so I'm not like here to like adjudicate on it. But I think it was, one reader sent it to me, and then he sent me your report on learning. And I thought, well, I should finally read some of this guy that people keep sending me emails. I should read his stuff.
Well, I'm amazed,
it's very interesting.
Honestly.
And I think
I'm amazed that I was actually on your radar, because the thing is, like, I first read your book, Ultra Learning specifically. I think I read it like three or 4 years ago or something like that. And I remember reading it and then being like, oh, this is actually like a good book, because there's a lot of books. No, seriously, because like there's actually like there's a lot of books on learning out there that I just think are like they didn't really get it. Like, like it's not really, it's either way too like isolated, or it doesn't really look at it kind of more holistically, or it's sometimes just wrong, like just plainly like
and I'm happy to talk with someone like when the reader of mine sent me your report on learning, like it was true that, okay, well, this guy actually has read a lot of research, because that's not always true. I feel like I don't want to name names. I don't like to like start feuds with people, but there are people in the learning space who, like, I don't know what they're reading. They're not reading research. Like, like there's a lot of stuff where it's like, well, I don't know about that. I don't know about that. So I feel like you're a conscientious and thoughtful person. I don't know. Like there's probably some stuff we agree with, some stuff we disagree with, and like we have different perspectives. But I think at least there's like the same, we've read some of the same things, we've thought about some of the same things, as opposed to like, you can talk to people who like learning, especially is a topic that's, you can kind of take it in a romantic direction. And so there's like people who write about it where they don't have any knowledge of any of the cognitive psychology, educational psychology, any of the like empirical results. And, they're saying things which are like, maybe that's true, but it's like totally divorced from any kind of thing there. So I think there's a deep reservoir of things that overlap that we've read that, the basis of an opinion, the basis of a conversation we could have.
Yeah, definitely. And you're not naming names, but like I can think of a lot of those instances. I mean, I think how I see myself is that like I'm in a position where I can spend a lot of time reading through the research, and then I can spend a lot of time practicing and applying and really coaching it for people. A lot of people have experience, I think, but their experience is through like, I went and did a seminar, I did a workshop, I did consulting, and it's like a cross-sectional view of what's happening. Whereas I really find a lot of value in the longitudinal data of taking a group of learners and following them very intimately for not just a couple of weeks, but like years even, to see what is the impact, and then where are all the permutations of the advice that I'm giving, and kind of refining it that way. So,
I mean, we were just talking about how like people coming from different perspectives and stuff. And I think my sort of starting point was very much like from the personal experience angle. So when I was in university, I was studying and finding, like, experimenting on myself of like productivity strategies and these kind of things. And there's some things that I think I probably got right when I was doing things. And there's other things that, like, I've now learned, well, that kind of works sometimes, but maybe it's not the best advice. And so I've changed my mind about things. And then, I did a bunch of big learning projects in my early 20s, which were basically the way that I established my career, which weren't research based, but they were, again, me trying to take on kind of experiments and, things that were hopefully interesting and useful to the audience. And then it sort of was starting with doing the research for my book, that I was going beyond the surface level of doing research. And then I've got another book that's going to be coming out in May. And I mean, that one was like, hundreds of books, hundreds of papers. Like, it was like years of just like reading research. And so I feel like I've come around that way, but I think I've come from a perspective where, I don't kind of like trying to arrive at the stage being like, well, I know everything and you should listen to me. I feel like I probably have the perspective of like, well, I have a track record for a long time period where I've been obsessed with this. So hopefully I know something, but I prefer to have like discussions about it than just take the mantle of authority over it. There's just really no substitute for, if you want to know a topic, like reading 150 books on it. There's no real way around that. I mean, you can definitely, I've got a targeted goal. I need to like know the abstract, the executive summary, but it's doing that work that I think makes a big difference. And so, but there's still further. I think there's still lots of places that I can drill deeper. And I think as well, I tend to be kind of eclectic in my interests. So
yeah, and I totally agree. Like, I like to read widely because I just think it gives you a more accurate perspective of the true state. And I think there are a lot of gaps in one school of thought that actually filled from another school of thought.
Yeah.
Which, on that note, I want to dive into different schools of thought a little bit more.
Yeah.
So just dropping straight into stuff that's like super technical. So the stuff that I tend to read around is more like looking around how constructivist models of learning, which are traditionally more, first of all, more like pedagogically focused and a lot more instruction focused, and tend to be based more around psychology, how that integrates together with more cognitivist perspectives. And the two previously, like, they didn't really mix too well, like cognitivist schools of thought, like the big people there, like John Swaller, for example, with cognitive load theory. Like, the cognitivist school of thought is all about like, how does the brain work? Like, how does learning work at a cognitive level, like at a process level? And then how does that, relate to all of these different things and link to all these different psychological theories? And recently people have actually really been trying to bring them together to be like, yes, we've got these psychological frameworks and theories and ways that we construct learning, which is the constructivist argument.
Yeah.
But then the cognitivist perspective is like, well, these are the processes that allow that learning to be constructed in the first place. And so I'm really interested in that interplay and all the research that surrounds that. I'm really not super into the pedagogical aspect of it. I just personally find it less interesting, but also because I work directly with students. So my goal is like, let's assume you have a crap teacher. Let's assume you have a, under-resourced school, whatever it is. Like, how do we make that work for you?
Yeah. I think you and I have similar interests because I mean, my driving motivation was for wanting to learn better was myself. Like, this is something that I care about. I want to know how to do it better. And, everything that is kind of I've been doing has flown from that goal. Now, I obviously care about giving good advice to people, not just this works for me, so I'm going to stick with it. But it's a different goal than someone whose aim is to teach students, or even more so to teach students that maybe don't even want to learn the thing that you're trying to teach them. And like, there's a lot of, I think, real world educational constraints that impinge on some of the goals. So one of the things I find really frustrating about a lot of educational psychology is that there's a lot of emphasis on, okay, given that this is what we want to teach kids, what is an efficient way to do that? But there's a lot less emphasis on the, well, what is it exactly we should be teaching? Because other than like reading and writing and arithmetic, which we all pretty much agree are important to be functional adults, there's just huge uncertainty over like what are the actual knowledges and skills that effective people use in practice. And so I remember reading, I forget which book it was, but they were talking about how like the idea of cognitive task analysis, which is this sort of approach where you figure out what knowledge they're actually using. And you can use this to deconstruct pedagogy. So you can, figure out if a surgeon is doing a surgery, figure out what is the information that you actually need to know to do it so that you can optimize the teaching process, which tends to be pretty bad in practice. Is usually like the see one, do one, teach one, which, I mean, while it's not there's worse ways you could do it, but it's hardly like from a scientific basis of like, this is the exact background knowledge. This is exact, like, we'll do this and don't do this and pay attention to this and this. So, as a result, we probably could be teaching surgeries better than we are right now. But the issue is that like this kind of super specialized approach of doing cognitive task analyses to figure out what is the knowledge and skill component of real world work is essentially missing. And so you have a lot of academics, who write books. I'm thinking of like E.D. Hirsch and stuff, who are writing books about like what every American should know. And there's a lot of research on like the role of background knowledge and reading comprehension and this kind of stuff. But I think like he's a little bit of an outlier in there that is even suggesting like, well, what is the actual content that should be taught? Like, what are the things that people should know? And so my interest in learning is very much related to this process of how do you figure out what you should be learning, because I think that's a huge part of it, which in a lot of educational psychology is just like, well, the assumption is that the student will know these facts, or even you can look at these psychology experiments where they're just like the information is really arbitrary and they're just really trying to identify a mechanism. So I think, you and I probably have similar interests there because we're more student focused. We're more like in the role of the learner. What should you do? I tend to be a little bit not super educationally focused, period, just because I feel like most of the people who come to me, most of the people who are learning from me are not actual like traditional students. I do have some college students. I do have some high school students, but a lot of the people are like, I want to be a better programmer on my job. What should I be doing? Yeah. Right. And I think that's a different question than like, how do I pass this particular programming exam where like, this is the curriculum and how do I get a good grade? So, there's a lot of interesting kind of philosophical questions about that as well,
Yeah. Well, like when I first made the program that I run, it was mainly initially addressed for students, but like now, if I look at the stats, like 40% of all of our members are just professionals. Like they're graduates, they're managers, they're CEOs, they're entrepreneurs, they're programmers, or they're like working full time. And not only are they learning on the job, but they're also thinking, how do I work full time and study full time? Like if they're going back to uni or doing a career swap or something.
Yeah, doing like getting their CPA or whatever.
Exactly.
You have to do
Yeah. And I do agree that there's one thing that you said in ultra learning, which I think it might have been like actually just at the very beginning, was just like the idea that like the modern world is there's just too much to learn. Like there's too much going on. It's constantly changing. Like the value of knowledge and just knowing things is just diminishing, and it's more about like the value of being able to know what to learn and then being able to learn that even without having like clear specific guidance, which I guess is the whole premise behind that self-directed learning approach.
Well, I think, you mentioned John Sweller's work. So, I mean, I've corresponded with John Sweller, and I think he's a very interesting thinker. And I think he's one of these people that, like, he also bet on a really unpopular idea that's recently become more popular. So it's like, if you think of the academic world as like stock picking or something, sometimes you pick an idea that's like not in fashion. And so in like the 1980s, when he's like talking about like, well, we should be doing worked examples. Like this is right after Newell and Simon published Human Problem Solving, and like literally everyone, like I'm reading, you open up these edited volumes and there's like chapters on physics where it's sort of like, it's well known that like, physics experts don't learn physics through lectures. They like, this was just and so he's saying like, no, this is how you like, so I appreciate him. I like him as a bit of an iconoclast. He's a little bit, he definitely, his beliefs range in like the more extreme direction. Like he adopts like on a sliding scale of like, it's between 0 and 10. He's like 9 or 10 for a lot of beliefs.
He's definitely,
but he's useful for that purpose of like, it's always good to be able to present like the pure version of an idea, even if it's just like you believe in something a bit more moderate, just because it makes clear what the actual ideology is. And so I think, people who are of the John Sweller vein are looking at classroom context. looking at the information that we have to impart students, and they're saying, okay, well, like this is the most efficient way to do it. And I kind of agree that for like a lot of skills, the Siegfried-Engelmann theory of instruction, direct instruction is actually probably an efficient way to do it, especially for people who are, you're not dealing with extremely motivated students. You're not dealing with students that have a lot of background ability. The Siegfried-Engelmann, like if there's a problem with the teaching, look at how it was taught, not the student, is like not how anyone thinks about teaching. Everyone thinks, oh, the problem is the student was too dumb. They couldn't understand it. And so I think there's a lot of value to that approach. But the thing that I realized when I'm like writing my book is that this is essentially inert as advice to you, because like if the assumption is, well, I want the best possible teacher who's going to break it down to me to every single step, it's like, well, those resources actually don't exist. Like outside of like phonics instruction and a few specialized skills, like there are no DI curriculums for doing these kinds of things. So I think my interest is like, I kind of am naturally pulled in the constructivist kind of paradigm simply because you're forced to. Like if you are the learner and you're designing your own project, which I'm not going to make any claims about that being more or less effective than a patient teacher who will explain to you exactly what to do, but more just the people I talk to, they're trying to learn a skill and they have very minimal access to teachers, or they only have a few fixed resources, or they only have a few things. And so the question is, how do you make those choices intelligently? And so I think just you and I, our focus on the student themselves, you naturally get pulled into pedagogical techniques that lean constructivist just because, well, who are you giving the advice to? You're not giving it to the teacher, you're giving it to the student. And so self-explanations, for instance, like that's a technique that I'm a really big fan of. And the critiques of self-explanations are, well, maybe the teacher should give the explanation. But if the teacher's not giving the explanation, the alternative is self-explanation or I don't know what. Like,
but that's not even the point. I mean, you don't even want like spontaneous self-explanation as a generative tool of learning is so powerful. Like you don't even want the teacher to give you the explanation, I think. And what you're talking about, I think, is a really like it's a really on point, I think, criticism of cognitivism, because I started learning about things from a constructivist perspective. I think everyone kind of starts from, because that's the more common one. And then I kind of went like, I swung the other way to, cognitivist. And then now I'm kind of like landing in the mixing ground in the middle. And one of the criticisms I personally have of like cognitivism is that there's very, very, very little in cognitivist research that is aimed at the learner. Like it's all instructional design and how, like, recently,
well, that's
it's
educational
like,
psychology writ large too, like even constructivist teaching advice is like, you want to be the what is it, the sage on the side, not the, what is it, not the
guide on the side, not the sage on the stage.
Guide on the side, not the sage on the stage. I'm screwing it up. But like these kind of things are aimed at teachers, and I think like as I said, I'm more on the cognitive side, I think, than maybe you are. Although I tend to not draw the distinction between cognitivism and constructivism. I would draw it maybe between like instructionalism versus constructivism, because I think constructivism is a cognitive theory. Like this is something that it's not a behavioristic theory, right? Like it's definitely something that comes out of, well, people are making these sort of complex mental representations in their heads, and they are creating them. And like, so, I think there's different schools within that, but I think pretty much anyone who's doing research now is some kind of cognitive thinker. Like, I mean, I guess you can say like the people who are like I don't know, you can say like the Jean Laves or the Barbara Rogoffs, or like the, some of those people are like explicitly anti-cognitivist, but I think they tend to be more on the like the periphery, the anthropologists and philosophers and stuff. But I mean, most people who are doing research the question is, how much instructional support should you give? What should you be giving? When should you be giving it? I think these are open questions. I mean, I'm really interested in also work like Manu Kapoor's productive failure, because he's like the kind of guy who gets in fights with John Sweller, because he's like, well, no, but if you let people do this kind of constructivist exploring the problem space on their own first, and then you explain the sort of correct method, they understand it better. My point of view from the student's perspective is more like, what are the kind of basic ingredients that you need to learn things? And I think you need to, for most skills, you need to have some kind of some kind of examples to learn from, so you can see sort of like what are productive methods, what are ways to do things that are effective. And then you need to do a lot of practice, and that tends to involve like trying to sort out, okay, what works in what situations, why does it work? So I think you end up having to do both of those things.
Yeah, one of the angles that I often take on this, like just even broader topic, is I kind of think that in most schools and probably in most classes, the quality of teaching isn't the best that it could be, you know, based on all the research. But I sort of think like we're reaching a point where it's probably not the main bottleneck anymore. Like I think general pedagogical principles that are relatively widely followed, like they're probably good enough for someone to learn well from if they knew how to take that information and work with it in the right way. And so I have a lot of focus on like, okay, you've got some people that could receive the worst type of instruction and the worst type, no examples, no whatever, like they're essentially just purely learning independently. And they can develop very deep expertise, you know, have great memory, all of these things, be an incredibly efficient learner. And you've got someone else that might struggle, even if they have what is considered like best practice teaching, which, you know, whatever that means. And so I sort of think about it from like the perspective that, well, what is going on inside the head of that student that's able to just make it work for them? Like, how are they manipulating and processing that information, and how are they able to navigate learning, explore it in an effective way, to get to a spontaneous self-explanation that's meaningful? Like inquiry-based learning, I think, is a really, really good example of this, where there's a lot of good proponents for inquiry-based learning, and the theory has a lot kind of going for it. But honestly, the execution of inquiry-based learning and the implementation and the lack of guidance, it like really cripples it. I mean, when you look at these like meta-analytical level studies on inquiry-based learning, it's like, does it even have an effect? And there's like so much instructional variation and dependency, and like it depends on the facilitator and intrinsic motivation issues and all of that. And it's like, you know, inquiry-based learning purely as just a theory, there is a lot of merit to it. But like if we're constantly looking at like what's the perfect way to guide the teacher to like control the cognitive process of every single student inside the classroom, I just sort of think that's not even really viable. Like that's not even conceptually seems realistic. So
I think what you're saying is probably correct. Like I think there's a lot of variation in how these principles are implemented, and like this is the thing that I also am finding frustrating as I get deeper, is that you start to realize that like once you get a few basic building blocks in, the nuances of like the student, the curriculum, the specifics really start to matter. And so advice that you do X in this situation and Y in the other situation, it starts to be less clear. It's not just, well, do this, like do flashcards, for instance. It's knowing exactly which flashcards you make, which things should be done with flashcards, which things shouldn't be done with flashcards. But like, and that's hard to explain to people without having a mental model of how the learning process works. Like, like flashcards is an example that I think is very interesting, because even within language learning, which is one of, I think, the like early language learning is one of the clearest cases where flashcards could be beneficial. Like I basically don't use it if I'm like learning like physics or something. Like I don't think it's that useful for that. But language learning, where you have to memorize a lot of vocabulary, it's like at least a tool that it makes sense in that context. But even there's a lot of factors that determine whether it's effective. And so sometimes I'll give people advice like, oh, you want to do flashcards, and then they'll be emailing me their specific flashcards, and you're kind of like, no, don't do that, because you're going to have this problem. So like an example, someone was a kind of an intermediate level of English. Their background language was French. And they were showing me examples of flashcards they were making for learning English. And the issue they were having is like, okay, you can do flashcards where you're going from the, so I'll say from your native language to the target language. So in this case, this person is trying to learn English, so they have French on one side and they're going to English. And the idea is that this person was trying to learn more and more sophisticated vocabulary. So you're trying to get into an area where there's now synonyms for words that you have. And the issue is that like from a zero context flashcard where you do like, I want to do like the word red, I'm going to use English for both of them so it makes sense, but I'm going to do red. And then I can say like crimson, vermilion, scarlet, like all these words that also mean red. They don't exactly mean the same thing, but you know, they basically mean red. And you know, you have to pick up the context for using, like, flashcards are a bad way to learn synonyms like that,
Yeah.
because
Yeah.
you're essentially doing this like, you know, from memory studies that if you're trying to do a single input and have multiple different responses, that's like the highest level of negative transfer. That's the highest level of interference. You know, even the behaviorists back, like Osgood, had this whole transfer surface, and it was like, that was like the lowest point, like the hardest point where you're having the most difficulty learning. Like, I was trying to tell him, you know what, I probably, like, there's maybe a creative way to use flashcards to get around this problem, but to me, it's just like, at that point, don't use flashcards, right? Like, if you're trying to have more expressive writing where you're using more vocabulary, I mean, do these little essay assignments, get someone to grade it. And then, like, you know, you can set up constraints where you, like, they just like highlight some words and say, like, use a different word in this context or try a different word. Like, that's how I, as a writer, build up a large vocabulary that I can produce, is by writing and trying to avoid using the same word for the same concept. You try to, like, you know, that if you read any highbrow writing, that's what they're going to do. They're going to use synonyms. And so, like, this is an example where, like, a technique, flashcards, it works, but then you move it outside of its central paradigmatic context, and it just, well, now it's no longer useful for you.
Yeah, and I think that, you know, what you said about nuances, like, I like to think of myself as a nuance guy. Like, I think that the nuance, the details, that's where the power is. And like, one of the things that I see really often is when you don't understand the nuance, you don't understand the conditions necessary to make something work. Like, you don't understand the win criteria. And if you think the only win criteria is that you used the technique and then you don't win, which statistically speaking is actually just the majority of people. Like, the only people that can not know the win criteria, use a technique and still make it work, are the people who have such a high level of deep processing that they can probably just use any technique and they will just somehow be able to make it work for them. And these are the people that will, like, post their tips on TikTok and you know, they'll say, like, hey, this is the technique I use, you know, I'm like this top student, just do what I do. And you've got, like, millions of people that their only understanding is based on the fact that, okay, this top student did this, it worked for them. I don't know anything else about, like, how to make it work. I'm just going to use it, and they fully commit to it. And if they don't do it, then the only logical conclusion from their sphere of understanding is I'm just an idiot. I'm not smart enough. I'm not capable. And I see that, like, literally, like, every single day I have students that have been almost trained to believe that they are stupid because of the fact that they don't understand the nuance. And so I try to, like, unpack the nuance a lot, but again, like, the algorithm punishes it. Like, when I make YouTube videos that go too much into the detail and the nuance, it's like, people are like, I don't want that. I want the quick tip. And then if I make the quick tip, it's just like, well, this isn't detailed enough. And then, so almost I feel like really social media in general it's just actually a very, I know a lot of people say, like, YouTube's a great source of learning, and I do agree, like, generally speaking, but at the same time, I really think it is not, when what you're trying to learn is not what you expect it to be. Like, I think if you're trying to learn, like, quantum physics, you expect there's going to be a lot to learn there. But I think a lot of people expect learning to be, like, pretty simple.
Yeah.
And
they
so
want a list of tips.
They just want, like, the 30-second TikTok. And if it's not that, then they're kind of put off by it. And I think it makes it really hard to actually deliver, like,
well, I think this is just the tragedy of expertise for anything. And, you know, like, if you think about, like, a physicist, right? I mean, like, there's this famous study that, like, what the physicists were doing differently when they would see the physics problems is they can categorize it based on deep principles. Novices, by and large, can't do that, not only because they don't know the deep principles, but because they don't have, like, this kind of abstract mental representation of, like, physics and, like, okay, well, in this kind of problem, this is going to be the invariant, and then these are the things they're going to change. And, you know, you're not able to think of it that way, so you just say, like, oh, that's a pulley one. How did I do pulley ones before? This is a ramp one. How do you do ramp ones? And it's easy to, like, mock the people who are saying pulley ones and ramp ones, but it's just because their knowledge of the problem domain is weak enough that that's the only input they have. They only have knowledge about, like, that a pulley example or a ramp example. And so in a similar way, I think it's like that with learning. I mean, obviously learning is not scientific in the way that physics is, so that, like, you don't have, like, a guaranteed canonical right answer, but there's ideas like, again, this idea of, you know, using the flashcards in an expert like way would be sort of to understand, okay, these are the kind of situations where this is going to be effective. These are going to be the kind of situations where I'm going to run into certain problems, and maybe the problems are so big that it's not worth doing. And also, for me, like as a practical matter, when I was learning Spanish, I didn't use flashcards at all. When I was learning Mandarin Chinese, I used so many flashcards. Even with the, same starting from scratch conditions, you're using different things, but it's because, like, we can go to John's philosophy of cognitive load, that like if you hear a Spanish word and you can pick it out of context and understand it and remember it. Oh, creativity is creatividad. It's like, okay, I can remember that, once you have the phonology there. You don't need to do a lot of flashcards. It's actually better to just do reading because you're getting the context as well. Whereas if, you walk up to a Chinese person and you say something, they say something back to you, and it's not even like you couldn't even write it down on your phone, what they said to you, because you just cannot process the sounds yet. You can't, like, I have no idea what they said. Then grinding flashcards is going to help you build some of that base. And so
it's a comprehensible input.
But
right?
You need this deeper concept of cognitive load theory and the kind of idea that of chunking, and the idea that the amount of mental bandwidth it takes depends on sort of how much prior experience you have with certain knowledge types. And that it changes the efficacy of isolating drills versus, more kind of contextualized practice. And similarly, I used to give advice, I think I also started a little bit more on a constructivist direction, but my earliest advice was using things well, you want to be using analogies and metaphors to understand things, because if you're learning abstract domains, that is genuinely very useful. And it is how really smart people process it. But the problem is that I would give this advice to students and they're real beginners in a domain, and the analogies they come up with don't make any sense. And it's well, but that doesn't match the idea at all. That's just picking up some superficial element. And so I had made the same mistake that, if you're teaching physics to people, you're like, well, don't see the ramp or the pulley, see that it's, a problem of conservation of energy. And the idea is just that recognizing the sort of principles-based approach to the analogy requires you to already have some kind of understanding. And so how do you bootstrap that understanding? And so I think what works in learning for advice to students, as well as what works in advice to teaching, just because there are so many factors, so many mental models that you would need to tailor the advice to that situation, that we can study really hard-coded curricula, does phonics work better than balanced literacy or whatever. But for most questions that are not that well studied, you kind of have to do the principled approach, but the only way you can learn the principles is to have lots of examples, lots of experience. And so it's hard for people who are I just want some tips to pass the next exam, to give them advice, because there's so many things you don't know about their situation that would necessarily affect what's the correct approach, right?
And I think that comes down to the idea, some people have these deep processing habits and patterns of thinking that they're used to and that they're comfortable with. And a lot of that comes down to partly what we know now, that a lot of that is to do with genetics, and a lot of that is to do with their early childhood experiences. And we know that based on that, some people just have the ability to form these connections and build these schemas in a way that is easier and more effective. And then some people don't. And then the question is, well, how do we train the people that don't to get to the point where they find it, easier? And they may not ever get to the level where they are an apex genius. But, most people, probably everyone can improve on that, which is a segue to something that I wanted to go through. I want to find what are the topics we don't agree on. Because we clearly agree on a lot of things, and I want to find things that we potentially don't agree on. I think that's going to be a really interesting discussion in general. I'd really just want to get your perspective.
Yeah, I think again, because we're talking about it's very hard to speak in generalities. So I could make a broad statement I think maybe I'm more a fan of direct instruction than maybe you are. You're talking about your sympathy for inquiry-based learning. I think I'm more on the direct instruction camp. But
actually, no, I'm really a DI guy. Actually, I'm more DI than I have a problem. I like inquiry-based learning as a starting framework to think about the learner's role in the learning process and the self-directed aspect of it, and what inquiry can do for aiding construction. But I'm a really negative believer in the conventional ways that inquiry-based learning is actually implemented and thought about. I think DI is frankly superior to inquiry-based learning in almost all situations, in especially in a pedagogical framework, in terms of actually teaching this to teachers that can actually then pull it off. I think inquiry-based learning can be really powerful for a learner to understand some of the principles of, and then use it as a springboard. So one of the things that I actually teach is like, I say, okay, well, how do you gain the skills to, first of all, like gain more inquiry about a topic,
Right?
just to learn to be more inquisitive. And then how does exploring that, like exploring the question, open up to exploring more about a topic and seeing different perspectives? And then how can then you use that information to construct a model that you feel is like a good overall framework that you can scaffold off of? And then how do you update that scaffold over time as you then gain more information? So it's fundamentally like, a lot of people would look at that and be like, that's a, pretty like purist inquiry based kind of approach to it. Whereas actually no one talks about inquiry based learning from like a self-regulated learner, self-explaining, a mental model kind of perspective. It's just like, here's a problem, let's all try to solve the problem. What do you want to learn next? Like, it's just so general.
I mean, I don't know, but I think I try to avoid a lot of like pedagogically focused talks just because my own experience is distant from that. I mean, you are even spending a lot more time coaching individual students. I do have cohorts of students that go through my courses, so I'm getting feedback, but I have done some like private coaching programs, but it's not my like bread and butter. And so most of my interest, again, goes back to this real selfish pursuit of like, I'm interested in learning things. What would be the right way to learn something? And so like using the language learning example, I've now done a couple of them, and it's sort of like, what would be the right way to do that? What was the problem with how I did that the last time? And like, what would I do next in the future? So I don't know. I'm not sure. It's hard to know what our exact points of disagreement would be on, because again, like, you can speak in generalities of like, I'm team DI, I'm team constructivism or whatever. But then you get boiled down to like, okay, this is the exact situation. This is what the goal is. What are we like, what would be the best way to achieve that goal? Those concrete things of where you're applying the principles. I think some of the things that I've shifted in my viewpoint over time is that I tend to feel like, I'm more pro knowledge and memory than maybe I was before. I used to have this kind of stronger distinction between like things you memorize and things you understand. And my feeling now about understanding, because understanding is a real slippery concept, right? Like it's easy to say whether someone remembers something, but what does it mean to say someone understands something? And it's like one of those questions that once you start asking, you start digging, you get to interesting places. And so my current kind of like mental model of understanding, which is itself a kind of mental model, is really heavily influenced by Walter Kinch's construction integration theory of reading comprehension. And basically his idea is that like what we're doing when we understand something is you're constructing some kind of situation model of like in his case of what you're reading, you're constructing some kind of situational model. And what they've learned from reading comprehension studies is that you're to do that process, to understand something, you're combining what you extract from the text with knowledge you already have from somewhere else. And it can come from different places, but it's that fusion of knowledge you already have and knowledge you're gaining in the text to construct a representation that like, it's not explicitly in the text. Like so much stuff is implied. You have to know these other things in order for that to make sense. And so the idea here is that like to really understand things fluently and expertly, you have to have this huge knowledge base. Now, it doesn't mean that you should be like drilling it with flashcards. Like flashcards are really good for a kind of like fluent associative memory between two things, but really just reading a lot is a good way to build up these mental models and like drilling deeper into questions. And, if you read a book, read the rebuttals for the book to figure out why the people thought the first theory was wrong. Like that's going to help you really understand it better. Like people who are experts, they just know so many things that when, you're talking about psychology and you talk to someone who's been in the field for like 50 years, they're just sort of like, oh yeah, well, that's this idea that so-and-so had that's related to this and this. And you're kind of like, how do they know all this? But it's because, the layers of repeated, like constructing the situation model of this, it just becomes all associated and fluent. And so I think for a lot of people, the reason they struggle is because of that background knowledge deficit. The cognitive load is super high. They can't construct a situation model because they don't actually have all the information they need to construct the situation model. And so they naturally gravitate towards like, well, I'm going to memorize this because there's no situation model. They don't understand it. But it's not correct to say that like, well, the problem is that they need to understand, not memorize. The problem is that, well, they don't have the memories that weren't supplied in the class. They don't have the background knowledge that would be needed to do that. So I don't know how that vibes with what you're doing, but I think that's a factor in learning that especially outside of that, like, here's the material, what's the best way to study it, but like, here's your life, what's the best way to be smart, that I think was underrated by me, and I've come to appreciate more and more. Just like, you get understanding by having background knowledge that is not present in the explanation you're reading, But
Yeah,
even this is
absolutely,
only
absolutely.
comprehensible if you know some of the things that we're talking about,
Yeah. I think my listeners will probably find it pretty comprehensible, because I talk about these things pretty often as well. Like, there's a couple of things that I wanted to add on to, like the idea that people that have expertise, they read a lot.
Yeah.
And that's completely true. Like, they are interested, they're intrinsically motivated. Like, they read, like read widely, they read deeply. And the thing that I'd add on to that is, like, the other ingredient is that they think deeply about it as well. The reason I add that on is because, like, I've got a whole cohort of like PhD students or master students that, like, they read a lot. Like, they honestly read a lot, like a lot. And sometimes I just think, like, it's kind of pointless. Like, what is limiting you right now is not the fact that you don't have enough input coming in, is that, like, the way that you're thinking about that input is, like, far too superficial. Like, they could read a rebuttal, but essentially what they've said is, like, here's one argument and then this is the rebuttal. Like, they're still just thinking about it in terms of, like, I understand this one, I've now understood this one. Like, it's still very superficial. And so if you ask them, like, kind of a higher order question around it, like, okay, well, what do you think the implication of that rebuttal is for future research? Or, like, based on this interplay, like, what do you think is the research gap? Or what do you think is, like, an assumption that was made by this that wasn't covered in the rebuttal, but maybe that rebuttal, like, maybe indicates. And they're not able to engage in that because they haven't actually done that kind of deeper, more comparative thinking. So one of the things that I'm like a really big proponent of, and it's in a way like a recurring theme among my videos and the techniques that I teach, is whenever you're taking in any information, like, there's this quote by someone who I can't remember, but they basically say, like, memory is a residue of thought.
And Daniel
I think
Willingham.
understanding. That's right. Yeah. Willingham. That's right. Yeah. And I
like that quote.
So. I think, like, understanding is the same. Like, memory and understanding are residues of thought. And so when we think about it that way, it's like, so what are the thoughts that create better memory and better and deeper levels of understanding? So one of the models that I often reference, pretty often, not that I fully agree with it, is Bloom's revised taxonomy, which has that kind of hierarchical framework. I'm pretty sure everyone that's watching my channel probably knows about it, because I talk about it so much. But I don't often talk about what the limitations of Bloom's are. Like, Bloom's is extremely hierarchical, and the common way of looking at Bloom's is, like, you have to start at the bottom and work your way to the top. And I think there's a lot of research in the last, like, 10 years that shows that that's really not the way that learning works authentically. Like, authentically, people are moving up and down that framework all the time. And within a certain concept, like, it's not like you have one level and that's it. Like, you can have, like, it doesn't work that way. And so applying that idea that memory and understanding is a residue of thought, one of the things that I strongly encourage is, whenever you take information in, just try to operate at that higher order, so that you are trying to simplify, trying to apply, trying to compare, find trends, similarities, create analogies, evaluate the accuracy and significance of everything that you're taking in, so that when things come in, you're able to chunk it, so that the more you read, it is not, I think most people, like, the more they read, the more overwhelmed they're getting. Like, there's a proportional relationship between the amount of information they take in versus the amount of overwhelm and cognitive overload they suffer from. And I think a big part of that is because their information processing is not allowing them to create a model and a schema that is chunked and well organized as they are reading. And then that eventually gets to the point where, like, you've read like 50 articles, but you honestly just are like, you like lost the will to live by now, because, like, you don't know what's going on anymore. Like, you don't even know even less about it, because of the fact that you know too much, and there's nowhere for it to sort of sit.
Yeah, it's a good point you're raising. I think my perspective on it, and this is sort of a more global perspective I have on learning generally, is that I tend to come from a kind of school of thought of, like, maybe more pragmatism or like functionalism, like that learning is always learning for something. And so I tend to, like, I made a big chapter kind of about this in my book, where I talk about directness, but it was basically this idea that, like, it's hard to learn for something if you don't know what you're learning for. So like for me, I feel like the biggest thing that helps me think more deeply when I'm doing reading, and to not have it be that where I just like, well, here's the reading list and I got to go through it, is like I have a very active goal. Like there's a very strong purpose. It's got like, I'm not reading anything for no reason. I'm always reading it for a reason. And the reason filters how I'm processing it. And what's interesting is that like, I don't tend to think of it so much of like, well, there's just a hierarchy of better and worse thinking. It's rather that what I attend to is going to be influenced by that. And so I've even had books where I've read it under a certain frame of mind where I'm trying to get something out of it or trying to understand it or trying to resolve a particular question. And I read it. And then I come back to the book like a couple of years later from a completely different reference point. It's like a different book. It's like I'm reading, I'm like, oh, this is the thing that I was like, so you can cycle back that way. And so for me, like, because I'm a writer, because a lot of what I'm reading is going to end up in my writing. I mean, I don't remember the person who said this, but they made the comment, like they were also a writer, and they made the comment of like, when they read books, they're reading it so that they can do like a book review. And it's like, if I'm not going to write a book review, like if I'm reading it and I'm like, this doesn't merit a book review, then there's no point even reading the book. And but I kind of like that. Like a review is not always your goal, because a review itself is a kind of summarization. It's a simplification. Often my goal is to like get an answer to a particular question, like, what do the leading experts think is this, or what is the issue with this, or what is the boundary of this idea, or this kind of thing. And so it doesn't have to be for a review, but I think the goal directedness of what I'm doing when I'm reading, I think forces that deeper processing, because every time I'm going to a text, I'm reading it because, like, even if the because was like, well, you need to understand this idea because you don't understand this idea to make sense of something else. Like, even if it's like as broad as that. So I think this idea of like being able to construct a goal that's going to guide your processing when you're doing something is a certain sense of skill that you have to acquire, because in so many classroom contexts, the goal is really well specified up front.
Yeah.
And so when you're, again, you have this, like, I have this reading list, but I can't tell you how many times I talk to students where I'm sort of like, they're learning something. I'm like, well, what are going to be the kind of questions you get on the exam? And they just like blank face, or they're just like, I have no idea. And it's like, well, then I can't help you. If you have no idea what you're possibly going to be using it for, then any possible thing might be the right thing to focus on. If they're asking you to memorize the page widths of every single page, then like that should be the thing you're paying attention to,
Yeah, no, I love that. I want to share a little like kind of experience that I've had with my coaching, and I want to get your thoughts on it. Just it directly builds on it. A lot of the time especially when I work with, actually not just students, definitely I see it more with students. And one of the good things about professionals is that usually what they're learning, like, it is fundamentally very goal directed. Like, it's you could almost say it's somewhat utilitarian, like how they're learning. So there's that go direction and lens in the first place. But there are also a lot of situations where I'm thinking like CA, CFA, CPA examinations where like their course materials are going to test them on things that aren't necessarily related to their daily work, because they're not actually in that department, or medical, like doctors entering into training programs, specializations where they have to learn like really detailed pathophysiology of things, or like cytokine pathways, which they honestly don't care about because like they're just operating, but they need that for their exam. And obviously for students that are in these curriculums, what I find is that there is a difference between what we cerebrally understand as being relevant and purposeful, and relevance that is actually significant enough that from a cognitive perspective, it does actually allow us to encode that information more effectively. So for example, there will be a lot of students that say, well, I know that they're going to ask me these types of questions in the exam. But when they consume that information, it's still not more meaningful in a way because it hasn't actually created any more of a model. Like it is not more significant. It doesn't feel more relevant. It's kind of like a label of relevance. Like someone has just said, you need to know it because you need to know it. And so they still struggle, like from a cognitive perspective, with actually holding on to that information. And so an angle that I look at it from is like, yes, we all know that learning is easier when it's more relevant. How can we create that kind of same level of clear personal relevance, even when objectively speaking, it actually just is not that personally relevant. Like that high school student that, yeah.
Well, so, I think
yeah.
just, sorry, I'm interrupting a little bit, but I think it's not to say that my process is like, like sometimes I'll read a paper where it's like I'm just trying to get X from it. Like, you know, if I know I'm citing something that I've already kind of read a summary of the research, but I need to know exactly how they did the experiment so that I can write it up or something. Like, okay, I'm going to like skim right to the methods and I'm going to reread that part.
Yeah.
But that's not usually how I'm doing it. Usually it's more from an operation of like, it is a bit broader, because in order to have that level of goal directedness, you have to have a very clear picture of like what it is you're trying to learn in advance of learning it, which is, it's sort of a catch-22. Like if you already knew exactly what you were looking for, you wouldn't need to look for it. You'd have found it, right?
Yeah.
And so
yeah,
I think usually when I'm reading is from a little bit more of a perspective of like, this is important. This is going to fit into sort of like my model of how things work or how things work in this domain in this sort of area. And my goal of the reading is usually to be able to try to like, again, this is too broad a goal, but the goal is sort of more like, okay, if I were to teach this as like a lecture, like of course, like I'm going to have to give a class on this topic. Could I do it? And so like, there's a little bit more of a, when I'm reading it, like, I don't understand. Why did you do this? Right. Because I'm in my goal directedness, I know that I'm doing that. Whereas if it's sort of like, no, I'm just trying to get the information on page, 8 or something, maybe I'm not going to do that. So, I'm being a little hand wavy here, but I think, again, this writerly habit of, if I'm reading a book that I think is important, I'm like, I'm going to do a review of this book. And I have that in the back of my head when I'm reading it, changes the reading experience, because it's sort of like, well, okay, what, like, even in the back of my head, you're like kind of doing a draft of the article of like, okay, well, I'm going to have to talk about this. Am I going to talk about this and this, or is this a diversion? Am I going to talk about this? How am I going to explain this? Like how, like he spent, or the author spent 20 pages talking about this. What's the essence of it? Or what's the point that's interesting? And I mean, that colors how I do it too, because I'm also thinking of like, what's going to be interesting? What can I simplify? But that's what I'm saying about the task specificity, that I talk to doctoral students, for instance, or I talk to researchers, and they often read papers in a very, I had one reader write to me about how like he was criticizing me for being, for reading things with an like overly, what's the word? Being like overly like credible about how these people are doing things. Like I am reading this and just sort of like, well, this is what the paper said, and I'm just reporting it. Whereas his comment was that like the whole academic process, or the whole thing that he is being like inculcated, is to read things adversarially, like read things to be like, this is the mistake they made. This is the experiment that would actually prove it. Or this is what, but to me, it's not that one is right or one is wrong, but just the sort of the end purpose of the reading activity in his case is to produce a new paper that is going to contribute, compete, verify, like do something in the academic literature. I'm not producing academic literature. My job is to kind of like, well, this is what the people who were the experts, like I understood what they said and I'm reporting on it. Now I might not believe a paper. I might not, I'm not going to report on this. I think this is false, but it's from a different mindset. And so I think, again, the difficulty of like a lot of students is that these goals are, it's difficult to get someone to get these goals, I think, if they don't already have them. And I think that is one of the like the strongest reasons why people like John Sweller and stuff are kind of skeptical of it, because the teachers that are trying to like, well, we want to inculcate like curiosity and passion, and then you meet actual students and the majority of them in the classroom are like, when's recess, or like, and it's and it's like, okay, maybe that's a little idealistic, but for you and I who are coaching people who presumably care about learning and want to learn better, I do think there's some time thinking about like how much the orienting activity, how much what is this for? What am I looking at? Even if it's not like a very conscious, explicit process of like, this is my note-taking strategy, just a way of like, this is a way of reading this because I know this is what I'm going to be using it for later, and trying to select those goals in a way that is good for more purposes.
Yeah. No, I absolutely agree. And I think the orientating kind of activity, the priming aspect of it is like incredibly powerful for helping people to build that build the mental model. Another thing that I'd add on to that is like, I think something that shouldn't be overlooked or underestimated is the impact that someone's just prior habits of learning can have on their experience of taking in that information. Like someone who is used to being very goal orientated with their reading, when you instruct them, like, be even more goal orientated or like think of different types of goals, or, you know, like they know how to do that. Whereas like, give you an example, like I recently got back from India and I did some workshop tours and worked with some of the universities there, like thousands, and I've got actually just a large cohort of students in India to begin with. And when I work with some of the students there, like there is actually like an ingrained culture where the learning is just by rote and repetition. Like it's actually just, it's not just like, oh, it just happens. Like that is actually the standard advice given by a lot of places. And if you don't do it that way, like it's actually almost like frowned upon, and you sort of as like an outcast, or like, you know, you're crazy not to do that. And when I give these students instructions that for, you know, some other students, it might be like very fun, like, hey, think about like why you might need to learn this. Here's some example exam questions, like how you might be tested. And even if we break it down, like notice how this question, it tests you on just like a fact, but then this one really wants you to like compare the ideas and dissect it. And like we go through that. And then we say, okay, now I want you to read with that in mind, knowing that that's how you need to apply your knowledge. And then they read it. Like they still cannot actually form the model because they have just so little experience. And so they don't have those habits. And one of the things that I'm really interested in is like, well, what's the process when you take that type of student? Like, what's the process where you slowly get them used to actually building that? Like, actually what you said before, like you need to have a certain level of background knowledge to really make sense of things. I think there's another thing, like you need to have a certain level of background experience and skill at thinking in certain ways to be able to think in more variations of those ways.
Well, I want to touch on a thing you said about being in India and having the students very used to memorizing things by rote, and that being very much in the culture. And I know you also know about I think it's David Geary, who does the biological primary and secondary information and stuff. But to me, I think, you know, this is why I like the anthropologists, even though they're often quite frankly kind of crazy when they're suggesting things that are just like, you know, the mind doesn't exist, it's just culture, right? But the reason I like it is because, you know, if you are working in like a psychology lab and you're testing these, like, you know, like Sweller probably was like Australian junior high students or whatever, you're getting this really narrow slice of humanity, and no disrespect to him, that's just what you're doing. Whereas if you go to different cultures, I think the big lesson of anthropology is just like how different people are, like how much cultural variation there is. And that's even with the fact that, like, you know, since like the spread of imperialism and whatever, we've actually homogenized a considerable extent. Like, you know, ancient China was a lot more different from ancient Europe than modern China is, right? Like Xi Jinping wears a suit. Right. But I think the thing that we kind of are missing is like how particular our environment is, like how particular it is that we go to school for, you know, 16 years, that like almost none of our ancestors did that, like that we do tests and that we write them and that we read, and like how many culturally specific institutions there are. And so I think, you know, there's some claims about like Flynn and Fleckton intelligence as just simply being that, just that like as we've increased education and literacy and all these kind of things and nutrition and whatnot, there's been a like that to get a good IQ score, you have to understand how tests work, and you have to be motivated to do well on a test that's under time pressure. And that if you're a hunter-gatherer in the Serengeti, just none of those things even make sense to you. So like you're going to do poorly on that, but it has nothing to do with your like innate cognitive faculties. And so I think it was Barbara Rogoff who had some studies where was finding that like, I think it was in Mexico, but she just found that people in these cultures were better at learning without instructions. Like they were better learning just from observation. So it would in this sort of apprenticeship kind of mode where like the children would learn how to do some kind of household task without the adults ever explaining how to do it, just by watching. And that the children like paid attention more. Whereas Western children, through schooling, through kind of our culture, were just expected to be told how to do it, and they weren't paying attention quite as much on how to do that. And I think it's relevant, like what you're talking about, the like maybe Indian Western distinction, that, I mean, if you go back in Indian culture, like memorizing the Vedas was the central scholarly activity. Like you go 4,000 years of like memorizing the words verbatim, philology, grammar, like the entire culture was based on this kind of like this having an enormous significance of like not just understanding the concept, but knowing the words exactly right, which maybe is not there. Like, I don't know, the Iliad or whatever, there were some bards who were memorizing poems in ancient Greece, but I mean, it doesn't necessarily have a corollary here. So I think, culture has just an enormous influence on things. And so I think for good and bad, I feel like when you talk to, like, again, to use the Indian example, like maybe there are some situations where Indian students are maybe overly relying on memorization. Like, I've talked to Indian students where they get kind of frustrated because they're like, well, I can't use your tactic because they're expecting me to produce the definition of X verbatim on the exam. And it's like, well, if you need it verbatim, then flashcards and memorizing is the correct thing to do. But I mean, there's also a reason why, like in the United States, I think most of the people who have won spelling bees have come from India, because they have this culture of like this pedagogy this related to that. And I think there's cultural differences here. And I think it's just like, so many of these background assumptions we have are embedded in the culture. I think in Western culture, there's probably like almost a romantic assumption about learning, that like a lot of influence of Rousseau and Dewey and this kind of stuff. Like, when people talk about these like, oh, well, the school where you just drill knowledge into these kids' heads and there's no room for creativity and freedom. I'm like that wasn't the school that I went to. I mean, they just did so little memorization. They was like, oh, kids hate that. They're never going to learn. We did art projects and presentations, and like, that's what I remember growing up. So in some ways, like this mythos against like what traditional schooling is like, well, it hasn't been like that for, maybe ever, but like even like hundreds of years, it's been lots of influence of that. So I think the cultural impact is very important. And so when you're getting into a particular intellectual tradition or a particular like culture, like the adversarial mode of reading research, that is a higher order thinking ability, but it is also very much a cultural trait. It's very much a style that's imparted by being in a community where someone says, well, what the real, like, you see this whenever you hear researchers say, like, the first thing to look at is the methods section. Well, the only reason to read the methods section is because you're looking to figure out what's wrong with the paper rather than trying to understand what they were proposing, right? Like, it's a very much a strategy that's built around, this is the goal of doing the research, is to is like this intellectual chess game where you're trying to outwit the opponents. And similarly to like we should teach children to think like historians and like weigh evidence, and like most kids aren't going to do that, nor should they be, but that is something that you need to do if you're a historian. Like, that's what you should be doing, is doing that. So I think the cultural attitude is important. And so when people talk about, Sweller, these kind of people, where they're talking about the biological primary, secondary, I think part of the thing that's maybe missing from that is just like, a lot more of it's secondary maybe than we think. Like, a lot more of like the stuff that is taken for granted of like schools and these kind of things, this really is secondary. Like, it is something that just, if you weren't in that environment, you wouldn't learn.
Yeah, definitely. And like the background knowledge that you just accumulate from being in a certain we see this a lot when we look at studies around like international students and just cross-cultural, like people that have actually literally gone to another culture, and like there's massive adaptation problems that they have from having like the context of a previous culture's expectations and norms and background knowledge and cultural capital and things, and then going into a new one, and like they have perfectly the right like cognitive abilities, but it's just like they don't understand like what is this culture's context of how they want that to be outputted.
I think is an important realization to make. And often it only happens in those situations where like you go into a radically different scholastic or intellectual culture, and then you realize, oh, wait, no, the way that I've been thinking about it doesn't work here. And I'm struggling, and I have to adapt, and I have to like make explicit maybe all of the norms and rules that these people just picked up through osmosis,
I want to tie this back to sort of one of the themes we were talking about earlier, which is just around the idea that I want to make sure that, like, to put it in your words, like it's not inert for the learner. So it's like, I mean, just in your view, like what are the things that kind of make the biggest difference for someone who like they don't have that background context, they don't have these prior habits, they are struggling, they are putting, often a lot of work, a lot of effort, a lot of time, a lot of sacrifice, and that effort is not being met with either consistent or proportional rewards, because they can't just be like, okay, well, I'm just going to take like a 3-year pilgrimage across the world to like explore these, and then like, dedicate, read like 50 articles, like.
I don't know. I think my main, this is not like the most snazzy practical tip, but my main advice that I tend to give people, and I think it's very important because I think the motivational component of wanting to stick with something that's difficult is what people really struggle with. And I think one of the things that is like a real broad general lesson of cognitive science, of psychology, is just how much gaining more experience and having more like background knowledge decreases the difficulty of doing a lot of these tasks. And so like I think it's a kind of faith you almost have to have, and some people get it through just having like enormous success experiences in their youth and whatnot. But other people, I think maybe you just have to take it as an article of faith that like the thing that you're finding really difficult, that is really hard, that as you keep building the components, as I said, like, for background knowledge, you're reading more of the things, you're understanding more of the things. For like procedural skills like math and whatnot, you're drilling more of the component skills, you're understanding more of the component concepts, you're adding to your bag of tricks of like, well, I can make this move to solve this integral, and I can make that move to solve this trigonometry problem. That for like skills like languages and things like this, that like the individual chunks, the perceptual pieces of like how many little bits it's broken up into are going to slowly cohere over time. That as you build this, it's going to get easier and easier. And so I think this is a very difficult thing to believe in the moment, that when you're in the process of learning something, I think there is a sense that like you take it as granted, as fixed. And so I think maybe the thing that I would shout from the rooftops that I feel like I've learned personally, and that is, abundantly verified by cognitive science, is just how much the individual transforms as they're on the continuum of expertise. That like you are the same person, right. You are not any smarter. There's no upgrade to your mental hardware. But by the end of the process, you can speak a language fluently and produce long, complicated sentences when before you could like barely like make a single utterance, or you can quickly see how to solve a really difficult math problem when, before you're like still like struggling to do the algebra, or, even just like a topic like, okay, I want to learn neuroscience or PhD level economics or whatever. And you open up the paper and you're like, oh my God, I don't understand anything. And then it's just sort of like, okay, I take this little piece, I figure out what this definition means, I look it up, I try to explain it, I get a textbook, I read this again. Like this process of digging deeper, you're building the foundation. And eventually you read it and you're like the person who's the expert, you're just like, oh, that's what they did wrong in the method section, that's become you. So I think there's lots of tactics and lots of things that we could talk about. And certainly your work has been in trying to navigate and accelerate that process. But I think just believing that process exists, I think is hard for people. Yeah. And so I think that's, if there's anything that I would just like, want to put the hand on the shoulder and say, it would be that.
Yeah. No, I fully agree. And I would actually say that, like you are actually upgrading your hardware as well. I mean, because of how neuroplasticity works, like at the end of the process, like that transformation, like you are actually like it's a transformation. It's not transient. Like once you get that, like everything you learn in that domain coming forward, like it becomes easier and easier. Absolutely. I love the fact that you said it, because there's something that I talk about all the time is I call it order control, because a lot of people are really fixed on thinking, I need to learn everything in the same order it is presented to me. I need to start at the beginning. I need to end at the end. I need to go line by line. I need to go paragraph, one chapter at a time. And I need to understand everything in each paragraph before I move on to the next one. Yeah. Like that's what they understand. And that's what, sometimes they've been trained and taught as the right way. But actually, I always say, like, if the text that you were given, if the thing that you're learning from just happened to be starting from a point that was just more personally relevant and easier for you to understand, you would just do it in that order and find it easier to understand. So it's like, don't assume that the information that's given to you and the way it's presented is like, this is the only way to learn it. If building those little blocks is what it takes, then find the block that you feel that you can build. And as you continue to build those blocks, like things will get easier. And that paragraph that previously you're like banging your head over for like 15 minutes trying to understand, you take a little bit of a detour and you come back to that paragraph later, and now it's like 15 seconds, like, oh, it just makes sense because you've got so much more background knowledge. Like background knowledge is not just like 3 years of like a dissertation. That's not like background knowledge can be 3 extra minutes of reading about something, and it's just about how we how we layer that. So I personally really love the fact that that's the message that you decided to land on, because I just think it really holds back a lot of people, like, and it actually even affects them like emotionally, because of the fact that they just think like learning is this impossible task. It has always felt impossible. They've never been good enough, and like no matter how much effort they put in, it just never seems to really translate. It's like, well, it does translate, but actually just how you try to translate it in the order and how you build it, like, there has to be a little, a level of faith there.
Definitely.
So I love it. But I've loved the conversation. It's been awesome. I think it's a good kind of place to wrap things off. Scott, did you have anything else that you wanted to kind of remark or add on or comment on at all?
If you enjoyed listening to us talk, by all means check out my website, scotthn.com, and my book, Ultra Learning. I have another book coming out in May, Get Better at Anything. So that'll also, a lot of these conversations are a little, from being immersed in the research for 3 years. So you'll probably see allusions to that if you're getting that book in May. And just, it was great to talk to you, Justin, because I know we had been like orbiting similar spheres for a while, and not having bumped into each other. It was great to talk to someone who's similarly passionate and opinionated about these topics.
Yeah, no, it's been awesome. Thanks for your time, because I've known about you for ages, and I knew about you as the bestseller author from day one that I knew you. So it's
thank you.
It's awesome to have this conversation. But yeah, it's amazing. Thank you so much.
Oh, thank you.